I was born on May 11th, 1923 in the Bronx, the East Bronx to be exact, because there are many different neighborhoods in the Bronx. They all have their own particular color. The East Bronx was a working class neighborhood made up of six-story apartment buildings. Everybody lived in an apartment house. All the apartment houses were the same. They looked the same. It was concrete sidewalks and streets for cars. Very little grass, if any. I have only vague memories of the neighborhood. My parents, Mo Wagner, my father, short for Moses, who came over from Austria, probably when he was about 20, pretty uneducated, but obviously a man with a great ambition, because by the time I was born, he had a very successful tailoring business. My mother, Fanny Wagner, was born in the United States. Her parents had come over from what my family used to think of as Austria. I found out later that they probably came from Romania, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Maybe my mother or my parents wanted to make it all Austrian. In any case, she was born in this country and educated through high school. They married. I would suspect my mother was in her early 20s, my father probably in his middle to late 20s. My mother's parents ran a resort at a farm in Spotswood, New Jersey. And so they would live at the farm during the summer, and then they would move into the city during the winter, and so she went to school in the city. In any case, they were married quite a while when I was born, because I was a very late child. I already had a 13-year-old sister and a 9-year-old sister. My oldest sister, Muriel, and my youngest sister, Hortense. And where a nice, self-respecting Jewish family found the name Hortense, I have absolutely no idea. Anyway, I had these two wonderful sisters who took real good care of me, which means that I was pretty spoiled from the time I was born. I do remember that Muriel...
Arthur, take one, Smith College and beyond.
So I arrived at Smith College in Northampton, Massachusetts in September of 1946. I was 23 years old. I had just gotten out of the service, and the first thing I did was I found a place to live, which was a room in a doctor's house, an alcoholic doctor. I think it was something like $10 a week. And once I was settled in there, and it was that quick, you know, I was there like for the day, found the room, and I went over to the theater department, which wasn't very big at that time. I don't think there were more than 3 faculty, 4 at the most. And I went to Hallie's office, and she greeted me, and I found out for the first time that I was not alone. I mean, as far as I knew up to that point, I was the only guy that had been accepted. But apparently, between the my application and my acceptance, 5 other men were accepted into the theater program, in addition to 3 guys who are in other departments on the campus. So there were 9 men in graduate programs at Smith College, and we were the only men matriculating. The other 5 guys were really interesting. 3 of them were basically actors who had come from New York and who had been old friends, who together with some actresses had planned to become eventually the new group theater. They were going to form a theater organization once they finished their master's degree. That was Teddy Kazanoff and Gene Gross and Joel Friedman. 4th guy was Bob Barron, who was much more into business side of theater, and he ended up doing that. He was a a theater manager for many theaters in his career. And I'm blocking on the fifth guy, who was a designer. And we formed the group. Now, it's interesting, the women did not matriculate. Sylvia Gassel, who had been married to Jean Gross and was now living with Joel Friedman. I mean, that blew my mind. I didn't know those kinds of things went on. Unbelievable. Again, there's another actress whose name will come to me, who was, well, there was Jan Mars, and she only stayed for about a month, and she went back to New York. And then one other actress who became very, very famous. She was the original, in Tennessee Williams' The Rose Tattoo. So I will think of her. So anyhow, Hallie informed me of this, that there were these other students, and that they were actually preparing some scenes to show at a small gathering she was going to have at her house that night. And she told me where they were, and I walked over to it. And it was like a rehearsal room, not terribly big, but when I walked in, it was Joel and Sylvia throwing each other around the room. I've never seen anything like it. I mean, it looked really dangerous. Hitting and throwing and falling. Well, it turned out they were rehearsing a scene from Taming of the Shrew. And because of their background, which I'll get to shortly, this is the way they went at their work. And again, I had never seen anything like that coming from Earlham College, which was the only place that I really had any kind of theater experience, which was very genteel. So I looked askance at them, and they stopped their work and turned to look very askance at me, because I think I had a sport jacket on, and I had a crew cut still from the Army, and we looked at each other as if to say, you know, who are you? However, it wasn't long, but we were very, very close. They were very important people in my life. So that first year, Hallie, of course, was a great influence, but she was not a director or an acting teacher or anything like that. She was primarily an administrator. And a woman with vision, having been National Director of Federal Theater, which I think I mentioned before. So from her came a kind of an idealism about theater, what theater was about, what it could do, what it should do, what its responsibilities were. Inspirational is what she was. But we had no such thing as an acting teacher or acting classes. Well, Joel and Ted and Jean had studied in New York with Herbert Berghof. Now, Berghof was an Austrian who came to New York, became an actor, eventually married Uta Hagen. And so it was the HB Studio, which stood for Herbert Berghof, but which was run by the two of them together. However, she was not involved, or Uta was not involved at the time they studied with Herbert Berghof. And Berghof had a Stanislavski background and a Stanislavski approach. And so I really learned the first genuine things about acting from them. And Joel used to conduct the classes, and Joel was the most advanced, he was the oldest, eventually became a director. And so I learned my first real Stanislavski approach to acting at Smith College from those wonderful people who were there. Teddy Kasdanoff was married at the time. He had married just before he came to Smith. Teddy was probably the one that I was the closest to. We were both from the Bronx and had similar kinds of upbringings. He was married to a beautiful young woman by the name of Lee. He had met Lee when he was in the Army in Louisiana. And so here was this Jewish kid from the Bronx, 6'4" he was, and this lovely young woman from, I think it was Baton Rouge, Louisiana. They were a great couple. So that was 1946 is when they married, and they still continue to be married. So they've been married 62 years now. And so what we did was we did a lot of theater work. We did a lot of plays. Oh, there was one more graduate student who I almost forgot, which would be terrible. Her name, it was a woman, it was an actress, was Johnny Faye Nelson. Johnny Faye Nelson was from Texas, and she had been a Miss Texas. And she was somewhat older, at least older than I, or me, and she became part of our group as well, as a graduate group. And so we did a lot of plays together. And I remember we did Antigone, in which Johnny played Antigone, and then we did Rocket to the Moon by Clifford Odets, in which I played the dentist in it, and she played the dental assistant that he goes for, even though he's married. So we did some really interesting kind of work there. A lot of special people came to Smith to do some work. A guy by the name of Norrie Houghton, who eventually became the producer of a theater in New York that did some wonderful, wonderful work, the Phoenix Theater. He directed us in, what did Norrie direct us in? He did the Antigone. It was while I was there that I first met Alan Schneider, who of course became a very good friend and a colleague later on. Alan, who was a hot young director, was working in Washington, D.C. At the Arena stage at that time. And a very good friend of his, Dave Tuttle, came to Smith College, directed a play, directed a production of The Skin of Our Teeth by Thornton Wilder, in which I played Henry. That was a great role. And Alan came to see that in 1947, probably. And we continued our friendship throughout the years, but more about Alan later on. So what else? Let's see about Smith. It was just a wonderful time. I was on the GI Bill of Rights, which meant that they paid for my tuition. I got a stipend for books, and I got a stipend for living. I had a car, which my father bought for me, and it was a little Ford two-seater, two-door Ford coupe. So I was much in demand as a result of that. Anyhow, there were parties. We drank a lot of cheap wine, played a lot of charades. We were really like a group. We really were. And so it was 2 years at Smith. That first summer, that's an interesting story, we were looking for work, and I could find no theater work, so I took a job as a waiter in the White Mountains of New Hampshire at a kosher hotel. We had a chef. Actually, I think he was the pastry chef. He's a big fat guy or something. And one of my assignments was the table with the musicians, the entertainers at the hotel, which was okay. I mean, you didn't get as much tips from them, if you got any at all, but nevertheless, that was okay. That was something that I had to do. And I became aware that this guy was giving the people at the entertainers table stuff that was not fresh. In other words, the kind of the desserts that were served to the regular customers were not going to the entertainers. I guess I was idealistic about that at that time. People were being mistreated, no justice. So I complained to him, and he totally lost it. I mean, he lost it. He chased me around that kitchen with a knife in his hand. Well, the end result of that was, of course, I was fired. Because you can get another waiter, but you can't get another pastry chef in the middle of the season. So that was my first time. I went back to New York and just hung out. Then in the second year, we did E equals MC squared, a living newspaper, because Halley had been the inventor of the living newspaper, at least the American version of it. It was based on work that Erwin Piscata had done in Germany, in which they took a topic and they presented it in like newspaper form, but on the stage. Probably the most famous one was called One Third of a Nation. This one was called E equals MC squared, and it was about atomic energy. It was about the atomic bomb. And I was Halley's assistant director. The leading character in the play was called Adam, and so it was somebody who was representing the atom, which Halley had written, because she wrote this play, had written specifically for me to play. But when the administration found out that it was one of the guys who was playing this leading role, they put some pressure on her. So she was forced to cast an undergraduate actress in the role, which was fine. So a wonderful actress who had a nice career later on. And so I became her assistant director, and that was a very, very special experience. And I think that year we did Clifford Odets' Rocket to the Moon. Let's see, I was 24 at that time, and so I was playing this dentist who was, probably supposed to be in his middle 40s. And I thought that I was making the age, but when I look at pictures, you know what? I look 24. So that's somewhat of a disappointment. So those were two very, very special years at Smith. We graduated in June of 1946. I remember my sister and my mother came up to graduation, and that was very special. And in that last quarter, of course, I neglected, one of the most important things happened was when I had to decide on what my thesis was going to be. And it was just about at that time, or at least when I got to Smith, I was introduced, of course, to Stanislavski. And of course, there was only one book at that time, An Actor Prepared. And Frank Lloyd Wright, because I think it was Johnny who had a great interest in Frank Lloyd Wright. And so I had done a lot of reading, not only looking at his buildings, but pictures of his buildings, but I had done a lot of reading of his writings. And I began to see that there were certain aesthetic principles, what I called aesthetic principles, that were common to the two artists in different art forms. And so I proposed to Halley that I write my thesis on this comparison of aesthetic principles. And she got very enthusiastic about it. She had met Wright. Of course, Wright knew who she was because she was a famous woman. And she said to me, well, you have to go. You have to spend next summer at Taliesin. I thought that would be great. And so she wrote to Wright, and I got a letter from his secretary saying that Mr. Wright was going to be in New York and that he would be staying at the Plaza Hotel and that I should arrive at 10 o'clock in the morning on a particular day, which I did. I rang up, and a woman with a Russian accent, who was his wife, Olga Ivana, told me to come up in 10 minutes. Now, Wright had said that the only organic building in New York was the Plaza Hotel. Of course, that was because they probably gave him his rooms for nothing. So I went up to the floor, and I knocked on the door that I thought he was at, but there was no answer. But all the way down the hall, there was this figure going like this. It was Wright. So I walked past all these rooms. And when I got to him, that was my first surprise. I had only seen pictures of him. And given the nature of the man, I had expected to meet a giant of some sort. Well, he was very short. I'll bet he was no more than 5'6". All of his pictures were taken with him standing and everybody else sitting. So he would appear taller. No greeting, nothing. He just waved me into the room. I walked into this room, unmade beds. He pointed to a chair. I sat down, and he said, "Now, young man, tell me, why do you want to be an architect?" And I thought, oh, God, he doesn't know what I'm here for, he's forgotten or whatever. Well, it took 10 minutes for me to jolt his memory around to where he remembered that Hallie had written to him about me. And he said, I'm sorry, I can't invite you, I have too many architects who want to come, etc. So it was disappointing in that way, but not in the fact that I spent 20 minutes with what I considered to be the most influential American artist of the 20th century. So that was a pretty exciting time. So I wrote my thesis. It's the longest title in the Smith College Library. A comparison of the aesthetic principles of organic acting is a comparison between the aesthetic principles of organic acting and organic architecture as exemplified in the writings of Konstantin Stanislavski and Frank Lloyd Wright. And there is not an extant copy. Which is just terrible. Over the years, they disappeared. In fact, the last one I left at Taliesin itself, because Molly and I were were visiting there sometime later, and I left it with one of his apprentices, and I've never gotten it back. So there is no extant copy of that little thesis. But it was sufficient, it was accepted, and I, in due form, as I say, graduated. So in that last semester that we were there, we were, of course, looking for jobs, and I must have applied to about 25 colleges looking for a teaching job, but nothing was forthcoming. The closest I came was at Denison College in Denison, Ohio, which had a reputation for a nice, small theater program, and I ended up second in that search. The guy who took it had a PhD, I believe, from Northwestern, so I couldn't quite compete with that. However, while I was at Smith College, somehow I got involved with the Jewish Community Center in Springfield. And Springfield was about 20 minutes to a half hour from Northampton. And I remember I did some Purim plays for them, things around the holidays. I did some dramatic stuff for them. And so they asked me if I would be interested in coming and working for them, and they created a position. And so I became director of dramatic activities at the Jewish Community Center in Springfield. And so the next year, I commuted from Northampton and spent the whole year directing at the Jewish Community Center. I did, the name of the play, Maxwell Anderson's, it was about Sacco and Vanzetti case. Again, I can't think quite of what the title was. It was a play in verse, and I directed it, and I played the leading role. It was young and filled with energy. Well, in the course of the year, I got to know some people at the Springfield Civic Theater, which was a community theater. And so they eventually offered me a job to be the artistic director of the Springfield Civic Theater, which I took. It was $2,500 for the 9-month season. And so in the second year, I moved into Springfield, became involved with a young woman who eventually I thought I would like to marry. And when I went to her father to talk about it, he was very unenthusiastic. In fact, quite the opposite. And in my head, that became because of the nature of the work that I did, that I could not support his daughter in the manner in which he would have liked. So I had a friend who had acted in a number of my plays at Springfield Civic Theater, who was in the insurance business. And he offered me to come into the business with him. His son was not interested. I could come in that kind of shape, show me all the books and how much money he was making and everything. And it seemed like a great idea. So I spoke to my brother-in-law, who was like a surrogate father, and he said, why go in with strangers? Come in with your family, come to work for me. So, that's what I did. I retired from the community theater, and I moved to New Jersey. And that was the beginning of my 5 years in the shoe business.
Arthur, shoe business and beyond, take one.
So I decided to go into the shoe business with my brother-in-law. He had 2 stores at that time in Elizabeth, New Jersey. I knew Elizabeth very well because as a kid I had spent a lot of time with my sister Muriel and my brother-in-law Al in the house in Elizabeth. So I knew the city pretty well, but I knew nothing about the shoe business. I spent 5 years there. It was a long time, although when I went into the shoe business, I thought, okay, this is what I'm going to do. And, and I'll get married and I'll have that kind of a life. However, the relationship that I had at the time, of course, didn't hold. We were geographically undesirable. And I guess I could have left at that time, but I had made a commitment, and so I stayed on. So those 5 years, how best to describe them? I lived in my sister's home. I had my room up in the attic. I was fed marvelously. I made a relatively good salary. I had my car. I had a lot of freedom. The only thing that I didn't have was an interesting thing to do. Although in the beginning I probably found it interesting because it was a challenge and things of that sort, and I learned how to sell shoes, and I learned how to buy shoes, and I knew how to sell the second pair, which was the important thing. And so I basically managed the women's store, which was the big store. And we sold high-end women's shoes. They cost $13.50. That's $13.50. There are now shoes in the Times that are advertised at $1,350. But we sold very good women's shoes. The second shop was a Florsheim shop. Florsheim, which was the leading men's brand at that time, was an enormous operation out of Chicago. And this was an exclusive Florsheim men's shops. That's all we carried was Florsheim shoes. It was about 2 or 3 blocks away from the women's store. The retail business in those days were terrible hours. It was 6 days a week. I think the store opened at 9 o'clock in the morning and closed at 6 o'clock, except on Thursday when it closed at 9 o'clock. So Thursday was a 12-hour day. And we were there all 6 days. For the 5 years that I worked in that shoe business, I was in that store 6 days a week. When I had been there maybe 2 or 3 months, one of our customers, it turned out, rode horses. And he invited me to go out riding with him. Now, to be honest, I always was a little bit frightened of horses. You know, in New York City they were kind of big and scary looking. But I needed something to do. I needed a little more social life than what I was having. And so I went out with him on a Sunday. And he rode Western. And that was kind of nice. It was comfortable. It was easy. I felt good. I enjoyed it. It was out of doors. And I started riding regularly at this particular stable. And I did that for, must have been 2 or 3 months. By now it's like November, December. And the horse show was on in New York. The National Horse Show was on in New York at Madison Square Garden, and we had a television set with a little screen like this. And they showed the horse show, and I saw these people jumping horses. I'd never seen that before in my life. And I thought, oh, that's something I have to do. Now, in order to jump horses, you can't do it in a Western saddle. The reasons are obvious. You know, you've got the pommel in the front. You wouldn't want to land on that. So I then had to teach myself how to ride English. So the next time I went out to the stable, I told the manager that I would like him to saddle me up English because I was paying for the horses. I was basically renting them. I was renting a horse to ride. And I taught myself to post in an English saddle. And then sometime in January, I said to Jack, that was his name, I think I'm ready to buy a horse. I said, oh, I know what I said. Now I'm ready to start jumping. I need to buy a horse. Okay. So he decided, he found somebody who was selling a horse, and we went out to look at it. And I remember when we were driving out to see the horse, Jack said to me, now whatever he says, you say $400. Okay. So we get there, and it's this old guy, wise and old guy. And out comes this gorgeous horse, led by this young man. Just a beautiful, beautiful horse. And the young man got on the horse and took him around a jump course, a hunt course. And he cleared all the fences, and, you know, it was spectacular. And I said, Jack, I can't afford this horse. He said, whatever he says, you say $400. All right, so they finished with the demonstration. We go into this little cabin-like thing with a potbelly stove, classic, middle of winter. And I finally got my nerve up, and I said to him, I said, well, what do you want for the horse? And he said, $1,500. And I gulped, and I said, I'll give you $400. Well, I bought the horse that day for $450. And it was delivered to our stable, and now I had to learn how to jump. So I went to the library, and I got a book that showed on the cover a guy jumping. And it turned out that it was a Russian, and I remember he was jumping over a roof. It was like snow was on the ground, and the horse was jumping over the roof. And it was a book on the forward seat, which was a very particular way of jumping, that obviously the Russian military used. So I went to a Macy's, which had the best tack shop in New York City at that time, and I bought myself a forward seat saddle, a Pariani saddle, which you would probably pay $1,500 for today. I paid $125 for a new Pariani saddle. I had some clothes made, and I began to teach myself to jump that horse. Or I should say the horse. Sultan was his name. Taught me how to jump. And so now every morning I would get up around 6:30, call the stable, half-hour ride out to the stable. The horse would be all tacked up when I got there, and I went out and I taught myself how to jump. And then I began riding in shows. And that was pretty humiliating because I was in the beginning classes, and the beginning classes were all 12 and 13-year-old girls that I had to ride against. But I loved it, and kept me sane, I think, for all those years. I had that horse for 4 years, rode him almost every day, and it was a wonderful part of my life in those 5 years that I was in the shoe business. So I started to work there in 1950. In 1953, around in the fall of 1953, there were another couple who were customers in the store, and they announced to me that they were going skiing in Sun Valley. Now, I had begun skiing. I began that almost that first winter that I was in the shoe business, and I went off skiing with my nephew Joseph, and again, taught myself to ski. But I'd never really been on a ski vacation. I just skied sort of close by. I went to Canada and places like that. Well, these people were going to Sun Valley. And that was very, very exotic. All the way out in Idaho. at that point, I don't think I had been once to Chicago. Because my brother-in-law, after I'd been in the shoe store for a few months, he sent me to Chicago to spend 3 weeks at the Florsheim factory, where I learned everything about shoemaking. And that was a wonderful 3 weeks. But I had never been west of Chicago. And so I thought I would join them. And so I remember they were flying out, and I was not quite up to that for, I can't remember, whatever reason. So I took the train to Sun Valley, which I arrived in February of 1954. Sun Valley at that time had 2 places that you could stay, and that was about it. And there was the lodge, which was the fancy place, very expensive. That's where all the Sonia Henne pictures took place. And there was the inn, which was a beautiful place, but was less expensive. And I was in what they called it was like a dormitory room for 4 of us. There were 4 of us in the room. I think it was $3 a night. And the next day, I went out skiing with a guy I was rooming with, who I'd become quite friendly with. And we skied during the day, and then at the end of the day, as many people did, we went to a place called the Ram, which was like a cocktail lounge in the inn, not at the lodge, in the inn. It's where people would gather. Now in those days, you didn't change après-ski. You went to wherever you were going in your ski clothes, in your boots. Of course, they were leather boots. And all bundled up in your jackets and things like that. So I was sitting at a table with this friend, George, that I had just met. And in walked this young woman who came over to the table because she knew people who were sitting at the table. And we were introduced. And she said that her name was Molly. Now, because of the nature of our après-ski clothing, all I could see was the face. Couldn't make out anything else. Although I do think that we danced. I don't know whether we danced that first day, but I think we did that. Anyhow, it was a very pretty face. But in addition to being a very pretty face, it was the friendliest personality I think I had ever met. She was so wonderful, she was so open, so easy to talk to. And so I think we hit it off. I think Molly would say the same thing. She says that I caught her attention because everybody was drinking beer and I was drinking white wine. And I was smoking a cigarette with a cigarette holder. A long cigarette with a cigarette holder. A Pell Mell, I think, or something like that. Now, Molly had been there for a week. She had come the week before with some friends. She had a friend who was the manager of the lodge, so she was staying at the lodge. And she was staying this second week, but she was dated up every night, except for her last night. And so we saw each other during the day. And some days we sat around.